The cold had a sound to it up by Reindeer Lake. It wasn't just wind or the creak of the trees. It was a hush that filled everything, a kind of pressure that made you aware of your own breathing. Arthur Bell lived inside that hush. The world had shrunk to a cabin, a fire, and the whisper of his old shortwave radio. He had been a radio man once, years back, Coast Guard. He used to help bush pilots find their way through blizzards and storms. Now he mostly just listened, chasing bits of noise out of boredom, half expecting to hear nothing at all. It was the kind of hobby that gave shape to silence. Tonight, the air felt strange, the kind of strange that made you keep the lamp low and double-check that the door was locked. The fire had burned down to a dull red, and frost webbed across the corners of the window. Arthur turned the knob on his radio out of habit, hunting for something to break the quiet. The usual static filled the room, soft, endless, familiar. Then it shifted. A low tone rose out of the noise, deep enough to make the mug on his table tremble. It wasn't music or voice, just a vibration that crawled into his chest and stayed there. Beneath it came another sound, like breathing through metal, slow and uneven. Arthur frowned and leaned closer. The lamp beside him flickered when the tone pulsed. He had heard strange things before, signals bouncing off the atmosphere, fragments of weather reports from the other side of the world, but this felt different. This sounded close. He scribbled the frequency down on a notepad, an old habit he had never shaken, then checked the clock. 3:33 a.m. The cabin wood popped once, and the sound startled him more than it should have. He turned the dial again. Tone dropped, rose, then repeated in steady intervals, like something mechanical breathing in the dark. He sat back in his chair, listening. Every 30 seconds the pattern came again. Each time it returned, the air in the room felt heavier. He felt a pressure at the base of his skull, faint but constant, as though the sound had found a way to live inside him. He took off his headphones, but he could still feel it, not hear it. Arthur rubbed his hands together and forced a dry laugh. "Old man's chasing ghosts," he muttered. Still, he reached for the map folded on the shelf, the one marked with his old survey notes. He had spent enough time up north to know when something was off, and this was off. He traced the grid, made a few rough calculations, and realized the signal wasn't coming from far, maybe 20 kilometers west, deep in a stretch of forest where no one lived anymore. For a while, he just stared at the map. The thought of leaving the warmth of the cabin, heading out into that dark cold, made his stomach tighten. But something about the signal bothered him. It wasn't random. It was precise, deliberate. It kept repeating, as if waiting for someone to notice. He turned the radio back on. The lamp flickered again. This time the sound was louder. The low tone seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He could almost mistake it for breathing, but not human. Too steady, too patient. Arthur reached out and lowered the volume, but the hum didn't fade. It was faint now, leaking through the walls like a vibration under the floorboards. He unplugged the machine. The sound stopped. Silence rushed in like a tide, filling every corner of the cabin. He sat there for a long time, staring at the dead radio. The fire crackled weakly, the light thin and orange. Outside, the trees creaked in the cold. Somewhere beyond them, something moved, not close, not loud, but there. A heavy shift in the snow, followed by stillness. Arthur swallowed hard and looked toward the window. Only his reflection stared back, pale face, gray stubble, tired eyes. He waited for another sound, another sign, but the forest held its breath. He told himself it was nothing, probably a moose, maybe a wind in the branches. The mind made things worse when it had no one to talk to. He stoked the fire and poured fresh coffee that tasted like metal. Still, his eyes kept sliding to the radio. When he finally went to bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that the silence wasn't really silence at all. He lay awake, listening to the faint groan of the ice outside, and the slow ticking of the stove, waiting for the tone to return. It didn't. Not that night. Morning came gray and brittle. The sky looked like tin, and the trees stood perfectly still. Arthur's breath fogged the air as he packed a small bag. A notebook, flashlight, compass, his old field radio, and a thermos of coffee. He stood at the door for a moment before leaving. The lake stretched out beyond the tree line, a sheet of white under a pale horizon. The kind of place where you could disappear and never be found until spring. He looked back once, at the cabin, at the radio sitting dark on the table, and then stepped outside. The air bit at his cheeks. The snow squeaked beneath his boots. He started the snowmobile, the engine coughing smoke, and eased onto the frozen trail that wound through the trees. The hum was gone from the air, but in his head, he could still feel the shape of it, the rhythm, the pull, like something far beneath the ice had started to breathe. Arthur pushed the throttle a little harder, heading west toward the place the signal had come from. The trail west of Reindeer Lake was half buried under new snow. Arthur rode slow, careful of the drifts, the snowmobile's engine echoing through the trees like a heartbeat in a cave. Frost formed along the edges of his goggles, and the cold chewed through his gloves. The air smelled sharp, like metal and pine. He followed the shoreline first, then cut inland toward the coordinates marked on his map. The world here had no color, only shades of white and gray. Spruce trees leaned under the weight of snow, their branches frozen into stillness. The sky above was heavy, the kind that pressed down until even sound felt muffled. Arthur's compass twitched every few minutes, its needle jumping a few degrees and then settling again. It had been steady that morning. Now it acted like something unseen was tugging at it. He kept glancing down at it, hoping it was just interference from the snowmobile's motor. After 2 hours, he reached an open stretch of ground that didn't look natural. The trees stopped in a clean semicircle, as if something had carved the space years ago. Wind blew through and cleared the surface of snow in swirling bursts, revealing bits of metal beneath the frost. Arthur slowed the snowmobile, climbed off, and brushed the snow away with his boot. A rusted vent protruded from the ground, circular and thick with ice. Another lay a few meters away, then another. The air around them was colder, the kind of cold that came from deep places. Arthur set the map on the seat, knelt down, and followed the vents in a slow arc until he found what they were feeding. Half hidden under decades of snow and moss sat a square slab of concrete. In the middle of it was a steel hatch. The hinges were nearly fused with rust. A faded stencil still clung to the metal, Site 46 Project Gateway. Beneath it, smaller letters read Authorized Personnel Only. Arthur stared at it for a long time, the wind tugging at his coat. The coordinates he had written last night matched exactly. He brushed snow off the hatch handle, gave it a tentative pull. It didn't move. He worked at it with his gloves, then with his multi-tool, knocking ice out of the hinge line. After a few minutes of effort, the handle gave a short groan and shifted. He hesitated before pulling it open. There was a smell rising through the cracks, not rot or oil, but something old and stale, like metal that had held its breath for 50 years. He lifted the hatch fully. A ladder descended into a narrow shaft, swallowed by dark. Frost coated every rung. A faint metallic hum drifted upward, soft but unmistakable. Arthur pulled his flashlight from his pack and shined it down. The beam found walls of concrete, then a landing about 30 feet below. He tested the first rung with his boot, felt it hold, and began to climb. The cold deepened as he went down. The air felt thicker, as though pressure increased with every foot. When his boots hit the bottom, he found himself standing in a corridor, no wider than a hallway, walls lined with pipes and conduits. His breath came out in white plumes. The flashlight beam cut through a thin fog that hung motionless, like the air itself had forgotten how to move. He moved slowly, checking each room as he passed. Most were empty or collapsed under fallen ceiling panels. Old desks lay overturned, papers fused to the floor by frost. A few still had names stenciled on the doors: Research Division, Maintenance, Monitoring Bay. He paused at the last one. Inside, a control panel stretched across an entire wall, coated in dust and ice. Screens made of thick glass sat dark and cracked. Above the panel, painted letters read Acoustic Resonance Testing Unit. The words looked official, but meaningless, the kind of language governments used when they didn't want to say what they were really doing. Arthur set his flashlight on the console and brushed off a section of ice. Beneath it were switches, dials, and an old generator key. The hum he had heard earlier came from somewhere deeper inside the bunker, a low pulse that seemed to travel through the walls. It reminded him of the tone he had heard through his radio. He turned in a slow circle, shining the beam across the room. On the far wall hung a faded chart behind glass. Paper had yellowed, but he could still make out a title at the top: Project Gateway Frequency Map. Dozens of lines converged toward a single center marked Core Node 1. Arthur's mouth went dry. The coordinates printed below matched the ones he had followed to get here. He took a step back, eyes on the generator key. Curiosity wrestled with unease. The place felt alive somehow, but only in the way something dormant still twitches before waking. He told himself he would just check the system, see if it still held power, then leave. Nothing more. He turned the key. The bunker answered with a deep, mechanical groan. The lights along the ceiling flickered to life one by one, trailing into the darkness like dominoes falling. Dust lifted from every surface. Somewhere far below, machinery stirred. The hum rose in pitch until it became a vibration that crawled up his legs. Arthur flinched, grabbed the wall for balance. The concrete felt warm under his palm. He yanked the key back to the off position. The vibration didn't stop. It only deepened, spreading through the floor like a wave. A warning light blinked on the console. The glass over it was cracked, but the red glow was unmistakable. Words appeared on a flickering screen below it. Stability lock released. System online. Arthur froze. The hum turned into a slow rhythm, like something beneath the floor breathing in and out. He stepped backward, flashlight trembling in his hand. Another light blinked on, then another, forming a line across the console until the entire room pulsed in time with the sound. He didn't wait to see more. Arthur grabbed his pack, shoved the key back, and ran for the ladder. The air behind him shivered, carrying a sound like distant thunder. As he climbed, the vibration followed, shaking loose flakes of frost that fell past his face like snow. When he reached the surface, the hatch slammed shut behind him with a hollow metallic echo. The vents hissed softly. The forest above was dead quiet. Arthur stood there breathing hard, the sky dim and colorless. The sound had stopped, but the silence that replaced it felt wrong. He climbed onto his snowmobile, gloved hands shaking as he turned the ignition. The engine started on the second pole. He looked once more at the hatch, half hidden under ice. Then he throttled the machine and tore back toward the cabin, the white horizon swallowing him whole. By the time Arthur reached his cabin, daylight had dimmed into the dull gray of late afternoon. The horizon was a smear of white and shadow. The ride back had been rough, the engine of his snowmobile stuttering like it didn't want to leave that place. Parked by the porch and sat there for a long time, the motor still humming beneath him. The sound seemed to carry through the ground, faint but constant. He told himself it was nothing more than the echo of the machine in his bones. But when he killed the ignition, the hum didn't stop. Inside, the cabin felt colder than it should have. The fire had died out. His mug sat where he'd left it, rim iced over. Arthur took off his gloves, rubbed his hands together, and listened. There it was again. A deep, slow vibration. Not sound exactly, but pressure. It rolled through the floor in soft waves, steady and patient, like something huge breathing under the ground. He crouched beside his radio, half expecting to see it flicker on. It didn't. Power light stayed dark, but when he laid his palm on the table, the wood thrummed lightly beneath his skin. Arthur straightened and looked out the window. The trees beyond the clearing stood motionless, snow stacked on their branches. The sky had gone colorless. He could feel the air pressing against the glass. He opened the notebook and flipped through the pages until he found the coordinates he'd had written the night before. He stared at them, the ink slightly smeared from his gloves. He'd gone there. He'd turned something on. Whatever it was, it hadn't stopped. He poured water from the kettle, but the cup rattled in his hand. The hum seemed stronger now. A faint quiver passed through the stove door, shaking a bit of ash loose. It wasn't his imagination anymore. The sound was real. Arthur crossed the room and pulled the plug on the small generator he used for backup power. The hum continued. It came from below, from the frozen earth itself. He tried to steady his breathing. Maybe the ground was shifting, maybe a tremor, but the air inside the cabin vibrated with it, just enough to make the lamp's filament quiver. He turned the radio on out of reflex, hoping for static, hoping for anything normal. The speaker came to life before his hand reached the dial. Static roared, then steadied into the same deep tone he'd heard in the bunker. The noise filled the room, heavy and smooth, like the heartbeat of some buried engine. Arthur stepped back. The air around the radio shimmered faintly, the lamplight bending through it. He unplugged it. The tone continued softer now, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. He picked up the radio, nearly dropped it. The metal casing was warm to the touch. The snow outside glowed faintly through the windows, a dim blue-white that shifted when the sound pulsed. Arthur moved to the window and looked out. The forest looked wrong. The line of trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to sway, though there was no wind. The snow between them rippled like the surface of a lake. He stepped back, chest tight. The sound increased again, a slow build that made his teeth ache. His shelves rattled. A glass fell from the counter and shattered across the floor. He snatched his parka and flashlight and went outside. The air hit him like a wall, sharp and bitter. The forest stood still now, the ripple gone, but the ground beneath the snow vibrated softly. It wasn't wind. It wasn't machinery. He turned in a full circle, flashlight beams slicing across the clearing. The snowmobile sat coated in frost. The sky above was the color of steel, faint green bands of aurora bleeding across it. He shut off the light and just listened. The hum came from the direction of Site 46. It was distant, low, but unmistakable. Arthur went back inside, slammed the door, and stood in the dark for a long time, his breath clouding the air. He set the flashlight on the table and pulled out his notebook. He tried to write something, a description, a theory, but the pencil tip snapped against the page. He tore out another sheet and began again, this time in blunt, shaking lines. 3:33 p.m. The sound hasn't stopped. The ground is vibrating, possibly interference from underground power. No, not power. No cables here. Something is moving down there. He dropped the pencil, stared at the words until they blurred. That night, the aurora spread across the entire sky. Curtains of red and green hung above the lake, rippling silently. Arthur watched them from the window, his breath fogging the glass. The hum pulsed with the same rhythm as the lights, rising and falling in perfect sync. Then the radio turned on by itself. The sound that came through this time wasn't a tone. It was a single, drawn-out exhale, low and wet, like the sound of an animal breathing through a tunnel. Arthur froze. The cabin lights dimmed, the aurora flickered, and for a heartbeat, the world outside went completely black. When the glow returned, something had changed. Frost patterns, crawled up the inside of the window, forming rings that spread outward like ripples in water. Arthur watched in stunned silence as the rings moved, shifting, distorting, almost like they were trying to form symbols. He backed away. The air inside the room felt thick, full of pressure, hard to breathe. The hum swelled until his ears popped. He grabbed the radio with both hands and threw it onto the floor. The sound cut off mid-pulse. Silence filled the cabin again, but it wasn't relief. It felt heavier, like silence had weight now. He could still feel the vibration, deep in his ribs, as if the noise had moved inside him. Arthur sank into the chair, eyes on the dark radio. He tried to convince himself it was finished, that whatever he had turned on underground would run its course and fade. Machines broke down. Power ran out. That was the nature of things. But even as the thought formed, a faint sound drifted through the cabin walls, so low it barely touched the edge of hearing. It came in waves, slow and rhythmic, like something alive waiting below the ice. Arthur pressed a hand to his chest. His heart matched the rhythm without meaning to. He closed his eyes and whispered into the empty room. God help me, what did I start? Outside, the sky glowed red. The forest shifted. And somewhere, deep beneath the frozen earth, the hum answered. Morning came late. Gray light seeped through the frost-covered window and fell across Arthur's face. He had slept in the chair, head tilted forward, hands still gripping the arms, as if the night might return if he let go. The fire had gone out hours ago. His breath hung in the air, thin and white. He stood slowly, the ache in his back reminding him how long he had been sitting. The cabin groaned around him, small cracking sounds echoing through the beams. For a moment, he hoped it was the cold settling. Then he heard it again. The hum, deeper now, rolling through the ground like distant thunder. Arthur walked to the window and looked out. The snow beyond the clearing was shaking, not blown by wind, but moving as if something below it was shifting. The trees at the edge of the forest leaned ever so slightly toward the cabin. He whispered, "No," before he even realized the word had left his mouth. He knew he couldn't stay. Whatever had started at Site 46 was growing. If it had power enough to make the earth move, it had power enough to reach him. He threw on his parka, stuffed a flashlight and his old field notebook into his bag, and grabbed the small revolver he kept in the drawer. He had carried it for bears when he used to fish the lake, but today it felt like a toy. The snowmobile started after 2 pulls, the engine coughing smoke into the cold air. He gunned it toward the tree line, steering into the white horizon. The hum grew louder, the closer he came to the site. The sound wasn't just noise anymore. It carried a pulse, a slow rhythm that made the fillings in his teeth buzz. When he reached the clearing, the world looked wrong. The air shimmered faintly, bending light the way heat does over asphalt. The vents he had seen yesterday were rimmed with frost that pulsed like veins. The hatch stood open, a faint glow leaking from below. He hadn't left it open. Arthur cut the engine and stepped off the snowmobile. The hum swelled through his boots, vibrating up his legs until his knees felt weak. He looked around for tracks. The snow was smooth, untouched. The only marks were his from the day before. He approached the hatch slowly, flashlight in one hand, revolver in the other. The light from below shifted, sometimes white, sometimes red. It looked like lightning trapped under glass. Warm air rolled out, thick and heavy, smelling faintly of metal and earth. He leaned over the opening. The stairwell yawned below, the light flashing against the frost-lined walls. He called out once, just a sound to hear his own voice in that endless hum. It came back to him twisted, bent by echoes that didn't sound like echoes at all. Arthur gritted his teeth and began to climb down. The steel rungs were slick, the cold biting through his gloves. Each step down took him deeper into the vibration, until it wasn't something he heard anymore, but something that lived inside his chest. At the bottom, the hallway lights flickered in slow rhythm with the sound. The air was hot and wet, every breath tasting of copper. The vibration came from ahead, down the main corridor, where the control room waited. He moved carefully, the flashlight cutting through a haze of steam that hung in the air. The concrete walls trembled like something alive was pressing against them from the other side. When he reached the control room door, it stood half open, light spilling through the gap in uneven bursts. Inside, the machines were running again. Switches flipped by themselves. Gauges spun wildly. The frequency lights flashed so fast they blurred together. Arthur stepped closer, his boots crunching over a thin layer of frost that melted beneath each step. The hum climbed higher until his eardrums throbbed. The control panel trembled violently, and for an instant the glass over the meters warped like water. Arthur aimed the flashlight toward the center of the room. There it was. The air itself had torn open. It wasn't a hole, not exactly, but a distortion, an oval of bending light and shadow hovering inches above the ground. Inside it was movement, shapes flickering like film frames stuck between stills. The walls bent toward it, drawn in by invisible pressure. The sound came from there, building, twisting, folding in on itself. Arthur could see through the shimmer for a second, could see another place beyond it. A forest, darker than his own, lit by flashes of dull orange. The trees there bent in unnatural arcs, and something tall moved between them. The shape was vaguely human, but too long, its limbs shifting between motion and stillness. He stumbled backward, almost slipping on the wet floor. The distortion pulsed brighter, the temperature in the room rising fast. He shouted, but the sound died in his throat. The hum drowned everything. He ran to the console and yanked the emergency lever down. Sparks exploded from the wires. The lights flickered, and the distortion quivered, shrinking for a heartbeat before surging outward in a burst of light that threw him against the wall. Arthur hit the floor, ears ringing, vision swimming. When he lifted his head, the distortion had widened. The air in front of it rippled like water after a stone drop. From its depths, a dark hand appeared, long and thin, claws dragging lines of fire across the metal floor. He scrambled to his feet. The hand gripped the edge of the distortion and pulled. The rest of it followed. The creature stepped through. It was taller than any man, its skin shifting like smoke, its eyes two burning points of dull red. The air distorted around it, bending light the way heat bends a road in summer. Its mouth opened slowly, revealing rows of teeth that caught the light like broken glass. The hum dropped in pitch, resonating in time with its breath. Arthur raised the revolver, fired once, twice, 3 times. The bullets disappeared into the distortion still clinging to the creature's body. Each shot echoed back with a faint metallic ring, like a sound played backward. The creature turned its head toward him, eyes brightening. Then it took a step forward, and every light in the room shattered. Arthur didn't wait to see more. He turned and ran. The tunnel behind him was shaking, dust falling from the ceiling. The hum became a roar that followed him up the stairs, pressing against his back like wind. He climbed, lungs burning, hands slick with sweat. The ladder shook under his weight. When he finally reached the surface, he threw himself out of the hatch and into the snow. The sky above was alive with red and green light, the aurora twisting like a curtain caught in wind. Behind him, the hatch door slammed shut, the sound echoing across the clearing. Arthur lay there in the snow, chest heaving, watching his breath turn to fog. The vibrations still rolled through the earth, slower now, but deeper, spreading outward beneath the frozen ground. Whatever he had unleashed was no longer in the bunker. It was here, breathing with the world. The aurora burned high above the trees that night, twisting in red and green sheets across the sky. Arthur watched from his knees, breath fogging the air, heart slamming against his ribs. The forest was alive with vibration. Every branch, every snowflake, every inch of ground thrummed like a living drum. He forced himself to stand. The hatch behind him pulsed faint light through the seams, as though the thing below still breathed through it. Arthur stumbled toward his snowmobile. The world around him felt warped, colors too sharp, air too thick. He started the engine, gunned it hard, and didn't look back. The ride home was a blur. The forest stretched endlessly, the trees leaning inward as though they listened to him pass. The sky glowed brighter the closer he got to the lake, and the hum beneath the ice rose to match his speed. The snowmobile's engine whined under the pressure, coughing black smoke before finally cutting out. Arthur coasted to a stop. The silence that followed felt wrong. No wind, no crack of ice, no movement, except the faint, slow rippling of the frozen lake. The hum was still there, deeper than before, a sound that came from everywhere at once. He pushed through the final stretch of snow toward the cabin. Its windows glowed faint orange, but he had left no fire burning. He hesitated on the porch, his breath trembling. Inside, the air was warm. Too warm. His boots left wet prints as he stepped through the door. The lamp flickered. The radio sat dark on the table, but the light inside it pulsed faintly, a rhythm that matched the hum outside. Arthur felt the hair rise on his arms. The vibration climbed through the floor and into his bones. He set his pack down, crossed the room, and stared at the radio. The casing rattled gently, as if something inside it were trying to get out. The smell of hot metal filled the air. He reached forward and pulled the plug from the socket. The hum grew louder. The unplugged radio lit up, dial glowing red. The sound poured out of the speaker in long waves, filling the cabin with a deep physical pressure that made the window panes flex. Arthur stumbled backward, covering his ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from the machine anymore. It was in the air. It was inside him. He fell to his knees, gasping. "Please stop," he whispered, though there was no one to hear. The floorboards began to shake. The nails creaked under strain. A crack split the wood near the stove, and a column of warm air pushed through, smelling of soil and ozone. The tone of the hum changed. It became a pulse, a rhythm, a voice that wasn't language, but intention. Arthur dragged himself to his desk and flipped open his notebook. His hands shook as he wrote the only words that came to him. The frequency wasn't for communication. It's a key, a pattern that opens. Whatever came through isn't done. The gate's still wide. The light in the room flickered violently. The radio screeched. Behind him, the walls shuddered, the seams between logs splitting with sharp cracks. Arthur turned just as the window burst inward. Snow and wind exploded through the opening. The aurora flared bright red overhead, flooding the cabin with color. And in the doorway of the storm stood the shape from the bunker. It filled the space like a shadow given form, head low, eyes burning like iron pulled from the forge. Arthur raised the revolver and fired. The sound vanished under the roar that followed. The creature stepped closer, moving in a blur of smoke and sinew. The air warped around it, bending like heat over asphalt. Its growl hit him like a shockwave, throwing him against the far wall. He scrambled to his feet and lurched toward the desk, grabbing the microphone of his shortwave set. The machine hissed with feedback, its dials spinning. Arthur pressed the transmit key and shouted into it. "This is Reindeer Lake Station. If anyone can hear me, shut down your receivers. Don't listen to the signal. Don't trace it. It's not a broadcast. It's an opening." The microphone sparked in his hand. The creature's reflection moved across the window behind him, taller now, hunched, breath clouding the air. Arthur slammed the transmit key again. "Gatewave is active. Do you understand? Shut it." The power surged. A flash of white light filled the cabin. For a moment, everything froze. The hum stopped. The air went still. The creature was gone. Then the ground convulsed. The cabin buckled inward, walls splitting apart, glass and wood scattering into the storm. Arthur felt himself lifted, weightless, suspended in the roar of sound that had no source. There was a final flash of red light and silence. When the storm cleared, the cabin was gone. Only a circle of scorched snow remained, smooth and glassy, the ground fused as if struck by lightning. The forest stood quiet again, the hum buried deep below. Days later, an RCMP patrol found the site. They marked it off, took photographs, and left, deciding it was a gas explosion. The reports mentioned strange readings on their instruments, a low vibration that interfered with radios, but no one looked too closely. Weeks passed. The snow melted. The ice over the lake began to crack. And far away, in a small apartment in Winnipeg, a young man sat alone at his desk, scanning shortwave frequencies on a new receiver he had bought secondhand. Static filled the room. He smiled, tuning the dial with practiced ease. Then the static cleared, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum that rolled through the speakers like breath through a cave. The young man frowned and leaned closer. He checked the frequency number glowing on the screen. 19.86 megahertz. For a moment he thought he heard a whisper beneath the tone, but it wasn't a word. It was movement, slow and heavy, pushing against the air. He turned the volume down, then back up. Outside his window, the streetlights flickered. The hum deepened. The radio light pulsed once, and then a faint voice came through, distorted and calm, almost human. Gatewave connection reestablished. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to Descent into the Unknown for more horror content. If you have any real cryptid encounters, or you're a horror writer wanting to share your stories, please feel free to email me in the description anytime.